Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I'm honored to introduce this virtual event with Nina Kraus, presenting her book of Sound Mind, How Our Brain Constructs a Meaningful Sonic World, in conversation with Ani Patel. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. Tonight's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. Coming up in the series, Thursday, January 27th at 6 p.m., we'll host celebrated physicist and science writer Leonard Mladenov for his new book, Emotional: How Feelings Shape Our Thinking. To learn more about this and our other upcoming virtual events, you can visit harvard.com and sign up for our email newsletter, or check out the page harvard.com/science for more info. I'll also be posting a link to our Science Research Public Lectures YouTube channel in the chat, where you can view previous talks you might have missed. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our authors at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll shortly be posting a link to purchase Of Sound Mind on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and especially for science, because it really matters. And finally, as you have no doubt experience in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Nina Kraus is a scientist, inventor, musician, and the Hugh Knowles Professor of Neurobiology, Communication Sciences, and Otolaryngology at Northwestern University. For more than 30 years, she has conducted groundbreaking research on the biology of auditory processing, expanding our knowledge of the brain and exploring the ways that our lives in sound shape our learning. Tonight, she is joined in conversation by Ani Patel, Professor of Psychology at Tufts University, where he researches the cognitive, neural, and evolutionary foundations of musicality. He is the author of Music, Language, and the Brain, the first comprehensive study of the relationship between music and language from the standpoint of cognitive neuroscience, and of the lecture series Music and the Brain from the Great Courses. This evening, Professors Kraus and Patel have joined us to discuss Nina's book Of Sound Mind, a thorough and powerful examination of the partnership of sound and brain, which Marianne Wolf, director of the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA, calls one of the most beautiful, evocative, illuminating books ever written about how what we hear shapes who we are. In prose that has been called lively, accessible, and profound, Dr. Kraus shows how our engagement with sound leaves a fundamental imprint on who we are. The sound of our lives shape our brains, for better and for worse, and help us build the sonic world we live in. Without further ado, I'm delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Nina and Ani.
Hello.
Hello.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to be here with Ani Patel. And I hope we can have a good time discussing through sound. And really, one of the most beautiful things about sound is that it's alive, it's in the moment. We don't have a script, but we have things to say, and we can respond to each other in a way that really only happens with sound. So sound to me is just magical and scientifically accessible as a biologist. And I've been doing this for a long time, studying sound in the brain. And if you go to our website, my lab is called Brain Volts. If you go to our website, you'll see pictures of the different topics that we research, and they extend from music to concussion, rhythm, hearing loss, autism, reading, aging, many different topics. And you might even ask yourselves, well, what are they doing at Brain Volts? But it's all under the umbrella of sound and the brain. And my experience has shown me that this topic, if you just think of all the topics that I just mentioned, they are part of our lives, and people are interested in this. And as I talk to people just over dinner about what it is that I do, I find that there's interest, and oh my goodness, I'm interested. I love this. I'm so lucky to be doing what I do, and so I thought, well, gee, I would write a book and try to put all in one place some of my perspective about sound in the brain, some of the things that we have learned, and my hope is that there would be something that people would get something out of the book, no matter what their background is, even if they had no background at all in sound in the brain, or if they had a very specialized background like Ani, that there would be something there for everyone who is interested in that topic. And it turns out that sound is so under-recognized in this visually biased world of ours these days. And I think the biggest reaction that I've gotten to the book so far has been, I had no idea. I had no idea sound was so important. I had no idea sound was so important in making us who we are. And this was in people who sometimes work with sound in their lives. So I feel the same way. I'm always astounded by the power of sound in our lives. So I've tried to take a very informal tone in the book, and I've worked very hard to put things in plain English, because as scientists we can get so goofy and jargony, and yet I like to think that it is scholarly, in that a third of the book, no, 20% of the book, 20% of the book is references. So I'm not just saying. The things that I put forth are ideas that scientists have come up with, and so I try to make this biologically accurate. There are 80 illustrations, and I worked in partnership with Katie Shelley, who is an artist. And again, it was this back and forth of trying to figure out what I was trying to say and how we could illustrate these concepts that are often cartoon-like and whimsical, to get the points across, and also to make the big point to me. I think there is so much art in science, and to be as explicit about that as possible was something that I wanted to do. And I wish you could see the illustrations in color. They're even better, but they're pretty good in grayscale. Another point about the book is that it's, science is a deeply human endeavor. And, I think we sometimes forget that, but I think that's a very important part of science. And so throughout the book, you will hear stories about, about me and my mom, and just, how I go through life, and how discoveries and ideas about sound have a meaning for me. So that was also an important part of the book. And so the very first part of the book is how sound works. And it's a story that I've taught. I'd love to tell it again and again and again. And it's really about signals outside the head, sound waves, and the brain that makes sense of it. I spend a lot of time talking about learning, how the signals outside the head are interpreted by the signals inside the head, and how we have this communication with our world. And so a lot about learning, and I talk about my the quest of our lab, BrainVolts, to try to figure out how best to access sound processing in the brain in experimental animals and in humans, so we can use this information. I really want to be able to use this information for education and medicine, and to inform us about human hearing. The second part of the book, which is the biggest part of the book, is our sonic selves. And it's very simply put, our lives in sound make us us. And so I take, in part, there's a chapter on music, there is a chapter on rhythm. The root of language is sound, music and language, the bilingual brain. I talk about birdsong, noise, aging, athletes, the healthy brain and the impact of head injury, concussion. And then the last chapter is a call to action, is knowing what we know about the biology of sound and sound processing in the brain. What can we do for how we live our lives? And how does this affect the choices that we make in education and in medicine for making the world be as good as it can be? And I think that thinking about that explicitly is very important, because from the very beginning, people don't think about sound because it's invisible. And yet it's a deeply, deeply, deeply powerful force. Think of gravity, that's invisible too. It very much makes us who we are, and importantly, it is our way of communicating with each other. So I'm going to stop just with this introduction, and Ani, give you. I'm just mostly interested in what you have to say, and going back and forth with you, because sound enables this what Ian McGilchrist calls betweenness, this back and forth, right? So,
Right.
So what do you think?
Well, I have a little bit of a few notes I've made that I just want to start with. But yeah, just going to start by singing your praises here for a minute, Nina. Nina's work's been an inspiration to me for a long time. I love the way she uses highly precise neural measurements of sound processing in the brain, how she relates those to real world issues like reading difficulties, the effects of concussion on the brain, how aging affects our ability to understand speech and noise. And she examines people of many ages, and also looks at how different kinds of training, including musical training, can enhance the neural processing of sound, and how that influences abilities like reading and understanding speech and noise. Nina's work has played a key role in a hypothesis I developed to help understand why and how non-linguistic training can help enhance the brain's processing of speech, the opera hypothesis. And Nina also inspires me as a person because of her big-heartedness with her colleagues and her students, her scientific courage, and the way she's worked so hard to connect research on sound processing in the lab to the real world issues about learning, especially in underserved populations. So let's start by talking about that, Nina. There are very few studies that look at the impact of music training on the brain in the wild, in schools, especially with underserved populations. And you've done 2 of those studies. One was in Los Angeles, the Harmony Project, which you write about in the book, and another one in the Chicago Public Schools. These lasted 5 years, tested over 200 participants a year. These are difficult landmark studies, and they're important studies in terms of the brain and cognition, because you used EEG to study the details of how the brain responds to speech sounds. And you were able to show, using these longitudinal measures, which over time, that music actually causes changes in these neural signals and how those changes relate to things like reading abilities. So I just want to start with a question. If given those studies, which are so unusual and hard to do, and that you pull them off, if you could speak to young scientists who are maybe listening today, or to funding agencies who might want to do this kind of work and link precise neural measurements to real-world educational settings and issues, especially with underserved populations, what would you want them to know? What did you learn from doing those things that are such unusual kinds of projects?
Well, one of the things that I learned was to really become a part of those local communities, and I love that. We took the lab out to Los Angeles, to the gang reduction zones of LA, and then we were in Chicago public high schools, and it really involved the principals, the teachers, the music teachers, the teachers who taught language, bilingualism. We were interested in, what was the biological effect of music instruction, especially in underserved kids. What is the signature of poverty in the brain from a neural standpoint? What does speaking another language, because many of our kids speak two languages from birth, Spanish and English, and it turns out that there are huge advantages that come from speaking another language. But really the important thing is the connection with the community, both in starting. We couldn't have done these studies if the founders of the music programs hadn't come to us, and they came to us with a hypothesis to test. They said, Nina, we already know that the kids who play music in school are the best students. What's going on in their brains? And so they came to us with this question, and logistically, it really was very challenging. And I really need to acknowledge all of my colleagues at Brainvolts, and in particular Jen Krisman, who is kind of a linchpin in both of these. Yeah, I mean, she knew their phone numbers, would call them up. You're a teenager, you got to remind them of their appointments. But we got involved with them.
Yeah, and you were very creative too. I mean, I think in your book you mentioned how in the LA arm of this project you were having little brain EEG setups in janitor closets in the schools, right? That you had to run students in those little closets. I mean, that's so far from the normal lab experience that scientists are used to, but you made it work, right?
Well, but that was a very important part. As much as we love controlled experiments, especially with something like music, the more control you put on it, sometimes it no longer is music, and it is no longer music instruction. And so what was really important, and I think this is important for, you're asking for other scientists thinking about this, is thinking about if you want to be studying something in its natural environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is, we didn't want to set up a music program ourselves. I mean, we wouldn't know how to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. We didn't want to have some laboratory-based program. We did this because both programs in both cities were well-established music programs that were successful in teaching music for years. We already knew that. So they had all that infrastructure in place. And all we needed to do was come in and figure out what we wanted to measure.
Right.
And I think I want to take this opportunity to say that one of the core themes of the book is that the hearing brain is vast. Mm-hmm. And I think as scientists we often think of the auditory system as this place in the brain that in fact very much engages not only what we hear, but how we engage with our other senses, how we feel, what we know, how we think, how we move, more formally hearing engages our cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems. And knowing that as a biologist made me think that, well, music likely works because we know that music really engages all of these aspects of the hearing brain, the sound mind,
Right.
which is a combination of all of those things. So we really were interested in
Yeah.
looking at it biologically.
Why don't you remind our listeners or tell them briefly what you found in those two studies, because that they were important findings and like I said, rare, because it really got to the issue of, do people who have music training show better brain responses to speech and so things because they're born that way and that's why they got into music to begin with, or is it a result of music training? And of course, there's probably innate predispositions that contribute, of course, but the question is there actual effective training on the brain and the way it processes speech? And the only way to really get at that are with these experiments where you train people over time and you measure before and after both their brain and their language abilities, and you show that the changes are causally related to the training and not just things that were already there.
Well, we started out with two groups of as well matched kids as we could. So, we matched them on everything that we could think of, their cognitive, their reading abilities, their ages. And then we followed them over time. And, one group had music and another group had another enrichment activity that wasn't music. And we followed these groups over time. And one of the major questions that we had was, yes, we were of course interested in measuring attention skills and measuring rhythmic skills and measuring, because rhythm is so important for language. We were interested in cognitive skills, in memory, reading, but there are so many factors that go into those kinds of behavioral tests. And as a biologist, and at Brain Volts, we really wanted to know, can we root this in the brain's response to sound? So, a big measure was measuring the brain's response to complex sounds, to speech sounds, at various stages of the time that it took to do these projects. And so, we did these over 4 and 5 years. And so we would measure the brain activity, as anybody who's listening certainly knows, as I'm talking to you now, the neurons in your brain are producing electricity, which we can capture with sensors, with EEG electrodes. And it turns out that one of the things that we've really developed over the years that you can read about in our Quest chapter is about how we can measure how good a job the brain does at processing the different ingredients that make up sound. And one of the things that we discovered is that making music actually changed not how a child responded to all aspects of sound, but to certain dimensions of sound, in particular the harmonics in sound, which are very, very important in distinguishing consonants, different aspects of timing. So there were certain ingredients in sound processing that were strengthened in these kids. And I think another lesson that we learned, which was kind of a terrifying lesson to learn as we were learning it, was in both studies, after a year, we couldn't see any really significant biological changes. It was really after 2 years that we saw these fundamental changes in the brain, which I argue is what makes us who we are. I've formally, I certainly talk about this in the book, but I put together a 400-word. I was inspired by you, Ani. You like the opera hypothesis? I came up with the BEAMS hypothesis, BEAMS. It's just 400 words, but it it explains, in my view, it pulls together information that we have about how our experience with sound through our efferent system eventually changes our default responses to sound, our afferent processing of sound, and through the engagement of cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward system, then creates our memories for sound, which, what are we? We are our memories to a great extent. And so these programs were really helpful in helping us come to these understandings.
Tell me briefly what BEAM stands for.
Yeah, so B is for brain, E is for efferent.
Okay.
So the efferent is it takes the experience through sound.
Mm-hmm.
A, so after experience through sound, it changes how the afferent. So you can think of the efferent system as the brain to ear pathway, and then the afferent system as the ear to brain pathway.
Right, and one of the big
usually
themes of your
we
book.
go the other way around, but I'm saying no. We got the brain, and we have the ear to brain pathway, which this is really what our life and sound, how we engage with sound, changes how we just perceive sound from the get-go through our afferent brain, ear to brain system.
Right.
M is memory.
Mm-hmm.
And S is sound, memory for sound. So
right. So it's really about the two-way path between sound and the brain, because the traditional view is right, is that sound waves activate our ears, and our auditory system signals go up to upstairs where they're processed and cognitively and so forth. But a big theme of your book is how much information flows the other way, right, from the higher levels of the center all the way back down out to the very ends of our auditory system where we first pick up sound, and how it's really this two-way traffic, this negotiation between the outside in and the inside out that really gives us our experience of sound. And sounds like the Beams hypothesis nicely puts that together. Okay, well, I want to just ask you about one other kind of landmark study that you did. So you did a study of what are called biomarkers. These are things you can measure biologically that give you some measurement of some trait or behavior or outcome that you're interested in. And in another landmark longitudinal study that you published, you showed that neural measures of speech, so brain measurements of speech sound processing and noise, and specifically how the brain responds to consonants at age 3, predicted reading scores at age 8. Now, of course, auditory processing is just one factor in influencing development of reading, but you did find these correlations. And there are other factors like working memory, attention, aspects of visual processing, etc. But nevertheless, you found this quite striking relationship between something you could measure in a 3-year-old just by having them listen to these syllables and noise, and their reading scores at age 8. And you have a quote from the paper that you published about that in 2015 in PLOS Biology, a beautiful paper where you wrote, "Early identification of children at risk for reading problems is crucial. Interventions that are provided early enough can bring struggling pre-readers in line with their peers and offset years of reading difficulties." So basically, you're arguing for something like, let's catch problems with reading in preschool, just as children are beginning to learn to read, and not wait till 2nd grade when they're trying to read to learn and they're struggling and they're under great distress and their parents are under great distress. And I think there's a lot of interest in that idea of early prediction of later reading problems so that you can intervene at a time when the brain is the most plastic and you don't wait for them to fail before you start helping. But can you tell us, why are biomarkers important? These very precise neural signals we can measure from the brain and its response to sound. How do they go beyond what we could measure if we just gave kids behavioral tests of early reading abilities? And that's key for this whole field of neuroeducation.
Yes, because there's nothing you can do, Ani, to change the response that I will measure from your brain. It really is your years of your life, who you are biologically, who you are, because of your how you were born and how you have used your life in sound, and these very deep things that take a year or two to really develop. is what we would pick up if we play some speech, music, or musical sounds, complex sounds, and then we look at how your brain processes these different ingredients. And one of the reasons that it's so useful is that you know, in a 3-year-old, it's very difficult to ask him, you know, do you remember this? Do you hear the difference between this and that? You know, to test a 3-year-old, and which in fact our studies did involve testing 3-year-olds, so we know what that's like. And you know, you can get a lot of information, but
You mean
there's
on
just
psychological
nothing.
tests, behavioral tests?
Yeah, behavioral
Yeah.
tests. But there is a lot of information that we can get just entirely by putting some electrodes on, delivering sound, and measuring that brain's response to sound. And you know, you're thinking, well, why would, you know, sound processing in a 3-year-old tell you something about reading later on, reading ability? Well, you know, we know that language and reading is rooted in sound. And something that I think we often forget is the fact that as human beings, we have been talking for hundreds of thousands of years. And even as babies, way before a baby talks, he is hearing different sounds, he is making sounds. His life and sound is very, very rich already. His life and sound was already rich in the womb. You know, from an evolutionary standpoint, you know, our hearing is so basic, so fundamental. And it is really on this sound that then, you know, we can learn something like reading, which is really only 5,000 or so years old, in comparison to hundreds of thousands of years old. And we can tell from how a child is already making sense of his auditory world if he's going to have a hard time combining those sounds with the symbols of the page when later on he learns to read. And the other thing that is very much, you know, a cornerstone of the book is that how we biologically we are what we do. So this is important at every single age, and it's important if at 3 you know that your child is at risk for struggling to read. Well, this is a child you are really going to want to enrich with sound to meaning activities like reading, like music, or like, you know, there are various training programs for kids where they play around with sound. But you know, the more a child is engaged with making sense of sound, the better he or she will be later on when he needs to use these sonic abilities to apply it to not only understanding what people say, because again, that involves how we think, how we remember, how we pay attention, but also how we read.
Right. So it's interesting. So basically, you're arguing that these early brain responses, you can measure in 3-year-olds without them having to do any kind of task. They can even be watching a movie, right, or doing something completely unrelated to your experiment, and easier to collect than, say, trying to get them to do a series of structured cognitive tests, which for a 3-year-old can be very challenging and maybe can totally depend on whether they're thinking about a cookie they'd rather eat than sit there. That those can be predictive of later reading difficulties, but at the same time, you're saying that things like sonic training through speech-related training or even music-related training can change those brain responses in ways that then will enhance the acquisition of important abilities like reading, right? So it's both predictive but also malleable. It's not a fortune cookie that says, you know, you will have problems at age 8 if you have this brain signature at age 3. It's saying you're at risk. Probabilistically, you're at risk, but there's things we can do. And if we can get in there early, we can do even better than we would if we waited for you to fail and then try to fix it, right?
That's exactly the message. Yeah,
Right, right.
that's why it's so important. But you know, and I think that the fact that um, that you don't need a response from a person is important, not only in 3-year-olds, but you know, when you're working with an older population who might be experiencing some cognitive difficulties, but especially like in another population that we look at a lot are young athletes. You know, we
Right.
look at our Division I athletes
Yes.
at Northwestern
Yes.
University, and you know, it turns out that when you get hit in the head, you know, that's probably not the best time to be answering questions. But if
Oh,
you can
right.
just, you know, put a few
Yeah.
sensors on
Yeah.
and you know, because making sense of sound is one of the hardest jobs neurobiologically that we ask our brain to do. It really is a measure of health. And you know, we know that
Yeah.
it can disrupt the hearing brain.
Right. I'm glad you brought up concussion because that's such an interesting line of your work. So it also relates to this interesting point in your book that you bring up about noise and how we think of noise as something out there in the world, turn down the noise, but there's noise in our brains, right? There are noisy signals in our brains, and there can be a relationship between how much noise we experience in the outside world and how noisy our internal brain signals are. I'd love you to talk a bit about that because I think many people don't think about that. They think of noise as something out there, not something in here. Even when it's quiet out there, there can be noise in here.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Ani, because you know there's noise outside the head and noise inside the head, and so the kinds of people, groups of people who have excessively noisy brains.
Well, can you just say what you mean by that, though? Because
Yes,
maybe
so
people
so
don't
this
quite know
is
what that means.
if you just have EEG sensors and you are measuring the electrical activity that is not especially synchronized. You're measuring electrical activity in the absence of any stimulation of any kind. So
Spontaneous activity.
it's really just spontaneous activity. And you can think of it, you know, in terms of static, like static on the radio. It's often it's, as I say, it's unsynchronized, it's uncorrelated, and so it truly is noise, and it gets in the way of making sense of electrical impulses that will help you make sense of a signal. So think of it as this neural spontaneous noise, which is rather high in kids who have experienced linguistic deprivation. So kids whose moms don't have much education, that has been tied with reduced verbal linguistic stimulation. Some of these kids have excessively noisy brains. In some people, as we age, our brains can become noisier. And but on the other side, you know, we were wondering in our athletes. So you know, we have this NIH study that enables us to test all 500 Division I athletes, men and women, whatever sports that they're participating in. We test them at the beginning of the season and at the end of the season, and if they sustain a concussion, we test them serially throughout, right immediately after they get the concussion for a while. And so we do this. You know, we're in the 3rd year of the study, and so we thought, well, is there something about the elite athlete, and do they process these ingredients of sound? You know, the ingredients of sound like pitch and timing, timbre, phase. Do they process these ingredients any better than we compared them to 500 Northwestern students? So they were Northwestern students, but they were not elite athletes. And we compared them, and what we found is that when we looked at the processing of the different sound ingredients, we didn't see any difference between the two groups. So the elite athletes and the you know, other Northwestern students all had the same strength of, say, harmonic encoding, fundamental frequency encoding, various aspects of timing. But what we found in the elite athletes is they had uncommonly quiet brains. So you can imagine that it results in making the signals coming in, the neural signals that respond to the outside world, it makes them stronger because there's less background noise. So, and this is fascinating to me, just in terms of biological mechanisms. On the one hand, you can take a bilingual that enhances certain, speaking another language will enhance certain ingredients of sound, will enhance processing of certain ingredients. Being a musician will change, will enhance how other sound ingredients are processed. So you have kind of this enhanced sound processing, but then, and there's no difference in the musician or in the bilingual in terms of their background noise, their background spontaneous activity. That's all the same. No difference there. So they process sound better by enhancing the signal, whereas the athletes enhance sound processing by decreasing the noise.
And what does concussion do to that?
Concussion really disrupts sound processing.
And you see that in these brain signals?
We really see it very, very, very clearly. And again, concussion is such a tough problem, in that no two concussions are the same. Again, you talk about conducting a laboratory experiment. Well,
don't do it.
some athlete gets hit here, another athlete gets hit here, another athlete just hits the ground and gets a contre coup injury by just the way his whole brainstem, if you will, just gets banged back and forth into the skull. And so one of it's been very challenging. And the data are not, this is something that is evolving. Like it's not clear cut exactly how what aspects of sound processing are going to be disrupted, and in every athlete. What we typically see is that there are more ingredients that are disrupted early on, and then they resolve, and they tend to resolve in an orderly and systematic fashion. But often a given athlete will show no particular disruption in sound processing. But again, having an objective measure of what you want to call it, of brain health, very loosely, for a trainer, if a trainer wants to know, is my athlete ready to return to play? Or is this college student, is he ready to return to learn to the classroom? If you have an objective biological measure that can, indicate, he really doesn't seem to be quite ready to, we know that it's so common for athletes to get a second concussion after they've had one. Maybe if they just waited a week, and we could, because we see these responses change week to week. And so, so wait 2 weeks, and then it looks good.
So what's neat about this is you sounds like you get baseline measurements in all these people as they start their college experience. So what their brains, everybody's brain is different, right? And everybody's going to have a different level of background neural noise, so to speak. But what their pre-concussion brain looked like. So you can compare them to themselves and see, has concussion changed the way their brain processes sound, which is such an not an intuitive thing to think. Think headaches or other kinds of things. You don't think about sound processing with concussion typically, but these measures you're applying is showing that it's having this effect, which then obviously has repercussions on things like how well can you learn in the classroom, right? So
Yeah, but given that we're all different,
yeah,
having an experimental design that takes the subject as his own control
yeah,
is wonderful.
yeah, yeah,
Because as you
right,
say, you could start out
yes,
with two athletes that are
right,
very different just at the beginning.
yeah. And the technology you're using to measure this is EEG, right?
Yes.
It's electrodes, not just on a cap on the skull. It's just measuring signals that are there. You're not injecting any electricity, and it's much less expensive than MRI, right? The kind of fancy functional brain imaging that is tends to get most of the media excitement and attention. And so, in terms of portability and affordability, it seems like it has some advantages, right? You can do it in a closet in a school in LA, a janitor's closet in a school in LA. I don't think too many MRI teams are going to be putting their machines in janitor closets.
But I think
in
one
schools.
of the other issues about MRI is that unless you've got a cerebral bleed or something really catastrophic has happened after a concussion, an athletic-induced concussion, at least in talking to my colleagues who are physicians and trainers, they say that the effects of the concussion don't show up on MRI.
Okay.
So you really need for most concussions you need something that is really perhaps more subtle, more
Right.
precise in terms of being able to look at injury.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, I think we're almost ready to start into the audience questions. So I just want to end my part by thanking you, Nina, for writing this book and for making your work and your journey through the world of sound and the science of sound so accessible. I think it's an inspiring story, and I thoroughly enjoy this book, and I highly recommend it to everyone who's here and beyond.
Hi, so I'm here with some audience questions. So many good ones. I'm going to jump into this one from Julian Johnson in the audience, who just asks, sound is a preferred information stream for the auditory system. However, how does sound interact with other aspects of our biology, e.g. proprioception, various visual cues, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the best ways that we can understand it, well, we can understand it from a number of standpoints, but from an evolutionary perspective, sound is it is evolving from our very basic senses of, some of the first senses were animals needed to be balanced and to be upright, and then they needed to move. Did you ever wonder why your cochlea and your balance system are, they're next door? And we have vertebrates, for example, who are blind but never deaf. And so, hearing, which evolved from, the cochlea evolved from ectoderm, which is, like our skin. We got hairs here, so that has to do with touch, right? So, touch and movement is very, very, very much a part of hearing. And so from a deep evolutionary standpoint and from an experiential standpoint, we know that animals and individual neurons will respond to sound in different ways. For example, based on the hormones of the animal. Like, say, if an animal has just given birth, there are going to be certain hormones that are going to be present. And so then the response to that pup call are going to be different. And sound processing is affected by also not only how we move, but what we see and what we feel. So it really does very inherently, and that really is a deep, deep, Julian, thank you for that question, because I really tried to bring in as much experimental evidence, from a neurobiological standpoint that really shows, or at least it convinces me that when we respond to sound, it's a very holistic experience biologically with respect to our other senses.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. I'm going to do my best to kind of condense the ones that are similar. So we're getting a lot of questions about noise, the interior noise that you were talking about, as well as the exterior. So Mike in the audience asks, what comprises the noise you speak of? If I'm daydreaming, is that noise? There's no outside simulation. So is the absence of noise in athletes the ability to tune out anything other than the current task?
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
I cannot answer that truthfully. I don't know the answer. I just know that we have a certain amount of background noise always electrically in our brains, and this is something that we are able to measure, and the extent to which, I mean, there's so many. One of the things I hope really comes through in my book is that for most of the questions that people ask, there we don't have answers. This is for scientists to continue to look at. So, for example, to what extent is this background EEG, this spontaneous activity, to what extent is it affected, for example, by what an athlete, if you take an athlete who has, I mean, what a beautiful model, right? You have this great model of a quiet brain. What is it that makes the brain of an athlete become noisy? You might try to perturb it in some way, in term like you're suggesting, in terms of what you're thinking about. So I really, I don't know. And the other thing that I want to make sure that I also say is that and this is the beauty of science, I think. My students are always wanting to know the answer, and hardly ever is the response binary. It's almost always, it depends. And I think that's just, again, I'm just riffing off the fact that I can't answer that question, and maybe somebody can, but there's so many questions that I know I cannot answer, and I'm so happy about that.
I'll just jump in and say that mind wandering is definitely different from what you're talking about, with neural noise. And mind wandering it engages its own kind of network in the brain, and it's very structured. The activity that happens when you mind wander engages a specific brain network, and that's, I think, what you're talking about is, the brain is not just a sort of, when you're not hearing anything, it's not like it's silent in there. There's lots of spontaneous activity, and you're talking about kind of that level of activity that exists, and then how the signals that we perceive modulate that activity and how strongly they stand out from that activity. So it's definitely not the same as mind wandering. So
yeah, no, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you both. We'll move on to the next sort of cohort of questions about noise. Lots of people are questioning about just what it's your experience of interacting with people who have maybe had to deal with a lot of noise pollution. We have a question from Laura Zanini, who, could you comment on noise pollution in cities, living near trains, for example, what that looks like in the brain?
Thank you for that. So yeah, there's a whole chapter on noise, and I just wrote a couple of op-eds that maybe, I don't know if you post them afterwards, on noise. One was in Wall Street Journal, and the other was in LA Times, because I think when we think about noise in the world, we all know that loud sounds are harmful to the ear. But what I am talking about are moderate level sounds that aren't excessively loud to necessarily cause hearing loss, but they will affect our ability to think, to pay attention, to concentrate, to remember. I think many of us feel very stressed at times. Why is that? I try to make the argument that the background noise, and this isn't the loud noise, this is the background noise that is just a part of our society, has a huge effect on our biological health, on how our psychological health. And there have been some beautiful studies showing about how kids' ability to learn is affected by how much noise there is in a classroom that they're listening to. But I would ask that that we all give some thought to ask the question: is it necessary? I think that there are many sounds that really are necessary. If you go to an airport, airports are noisy places. Engines are going to be noisy. Conveyor belts are noisy. But do we really need, every time a boarding pass is scanned, do we need to hear 2 gates away, beep, beep? Do we need to hear everybody's cell phone when they're getting a message? I mean, they're on their phone all the time. Might as well you can turn that off. Like when you're looking for your car, do I have to wake up my neighbor when I'm locking up my car and I come home late at night? And there's so many little things like that, but again, that we don't realize. I mean, we've all had the experience of we can tune out noise very well, but then if the truck that's outside stops idling, or our air conditioner turns off, often our reaction is, so we didn't even know that we hadn't paid attention to this noise. It wasn't part of our conscious awareness, yet it made us tense because we felt relieved when it went away. So I really think that this is, again, an area that as a society we really need to think about. Gordon Hempton wrote a book, One Square Inch of Silence, saying that there's that there are very few places in the world where you can actually be without man-made noise for more than 15 minutes, because there are always airplanes that are flying overhead. And so, and again, if we think we're so visually oriented, we think about, we go to a beautiful place, you're in the mountains, and, an entrepreneurial person might think, oh, this is so beautiful, helicopter rides. Think about, what that does to the experience of appreciating the nature, and think about the havoc that it creates with all of the animals that need to communicate with each other, to mate, to be healthy. So, something that I also touch on in the book is how living things, any plumber will tell you that tree roots will go towards water, and they actually respond to the sound of the water. So they'll gum up your pipes. So sound is a part of life in a way that is really under-recognized, and noise is something that we can do a better job at, I think.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's the perfect place to end, and we are out of time at this point. Thank you once again, both of you, for this fantastic conversation. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about this fascinating book and purchase Of Sound Mind at harvard.com. I put the link in the chat a couple times. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, all here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and be well. Thank you both for this wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for the sound that connects us.
Of course.
Thanks, Nina. Good to see you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.